Good evening and welcome to another episode of Slantcast, the official podcast of Slant Books. My name is Gregory Wolf and I am Slant's publisher and editor. Thank you for choosing to share this time with us. Tonight we're looking forward to a stimulating book launch event for The Fate of the Animals with author Morgan Meese. But first, a brief word about Slant. Our endlessly repeated tagline is that Slant is a nonprofit, indie literary press. The terms roll off the tongue rather easily, but what do these words actually mean to us? Today, let's take one of them. We call Slant literary not because we only publish the classic genres of fiction, poetry, creative nonfiction, and drama. In fact, we're actively engaging in fields like art criticism, philosophy, and theology, as tonight's book attests. No, when we say literary, we do so because the hallmark of Slant Books is a belief in the centrality of writing as a craft, whatever the genre. To be literary in this sense isn't about being snobbish or elitist. It's about caring what language shaped by art can do to help us understand who we are. The great enemy of art in any age is the attempt to instrumentalize it, to make it serve political, religious, or economic interests. In his just published essay on the contemporary phenomenon of wokeness in the arts, William Dereshowitz says, woke aesthetics are brutally literalistic, a kind of socialist realism for the 21st century. They leave no room for irony or ambiguity. They make an enemy of the imagination. They reject the notion of artistic freedom. Dereshowitz goes on to contrast art with entertainment. Quote, a decent working definition of the difference between art and entertainment is that the latter seeks, like propaganda, advertising, or pornography, a uniform, predictable response. A laugh, a scream, a throb, a thrill. While the former inspires a different response in each of us, and different responses at different times, and complex, unpredictable responses always, which is part of what is meant when people say that art enables us to be more fully human. So that is, at least in part, what we mean when we say that Slant cares about literary art. Tonight, we are here for another exciting online book launch event, this time for Morgan Meese's The Fate of the Animals, published in September by Slant Books. Before I introduce our reader tonight, I would just like to remind you that if you have questions for Morgan, feel free to type them in the chat. Time permitting, I will share as many of those as possible. I've also posted a link to Slant's webpage for the book, where you will find at least 4 different options of different retailers, including the big guys and the not so big guys, to purchase a copy of the book for yourself and, one hopes, for your friends and family. And now a brief word about our speaker tonight. Essayist and critic Morgan Meese writes about art and culture for newspapers and magazines, including The New Yorker, Harper's, N+1, Slate, Virginia Quarterly Review, and The Believer, and was critic at large for the Smart Set, an arts magazine at Drexel University. A co-founder of the arts collective Flux Factory, he is also an editor at Three Quarks Daily. He holds an MA and a PhD from the New School and a BA from Eugene Lang College, where he has also taught philosophy. He is a recipient of a Creative Capital Warhol Foundation Arts Writers Grant and a Whiting Award in nonfiction. In Ruins, his book of essays on art, literature, and contemporary life, he explores the idea that we only understand our experiences after we have already lost them. His Dead People, co-authored with Stephanie Ann Goldberg, is a book of eulogies for notable figures. He currently teaches contemporary art and philosophy at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit. It's a great honor and delight to ask Morgan to read from us from The Fate of the Animals. Morgan?
Thanks, Greg. Let's start reading. I'm gonna start at the beginning, and then I'll jump forward a little bit here and there to give you a little more a sense of how the book develops, but I'll give you a heads up when I'm doing that. Chapter 1, the discovery of a book of letters written by a soldier and artist to his wife during World War I, and the recognition that this book of letters drives us into a consideration of the Great War, which was a kind of apocalypse. I bought a book a few years ago. I don't remember why, certainly not for the cover or book design, which is why I often buy books. Sometimes a book just looks interesting, and then I want it because the look calls out to me. Often the books that forced me to buy them were designed in the late 1960s and early 70s. Other times a book is so badly designed that this in itself intrigues. That was the case with this book. The book I bought is an English translation of letters written by the painter Franz Marc to his wife, Maria. It is a thin hardcover volume published by Peter Long as part of the American University Studies series. The edition of the book that I've got has about 6 different fonts on the front cover. Some words are in italics and some words are not. The size of the fonts vary considerably as well. It's as if a small child got into the final layout for the book just before it went to press and started changing things according to a game she was playing in her own head. The letters published in the book were originally written between September 1914 and March 1916. The letters ceased abruptly on March 4th, 1916. This was the day Franz Marc was hit in the head by a shell fragment at the Battle of Verdun. Marc survived the initial impact but didn't live for much longer. He was 36 years old. After Marc's death, Maria Marc made a selection of his letters available to the publishing house Paul Cassirer in Berlin. This was in 1920. The volume was entitled Briefe, Aufzeichnungen, Aphorismen, Letters, Notes, and Aphorisms. This is the route by which personal letters, handwritten by a German soldier who died in the Battle of Verdun, made their way into general English language publication. The preface to the original R. Piper edition of Marc's letters opened with the following sentence: Franz Marc's letters from the war belong to the treasures of 20th century German literature. I didn't know that when I first bought the book. I didn't know that it was a treasure, or maybe I did. Maybe I did somehow know that this was a treasure. I knew and didn't know that I was holding a treasure. Marc's very first letter, written almost 2 years before he was to die at the Battle of Verdun, is dated September 1st, 1914, autumn. The first sentence reads, "Today I stood guard for the first time with 18 men. It was very moving, a wonderful autumn night full of stars," end quote. The last letter, written on the day of his death and during the Battle of Verdun, begins, "Dearest, imagine. Today I received a little letter from the people where I was quartered in Magstadt, which contained your birthday letter," end quote. Near the end of his final letter, Marc wrote, "Don't worry, I will come through, and I'm also fine as far as my health goes." Several hours later, he was dead. The Battle of Verdun, though there were many extraordinarily surprising and terrible battles of World War I, is unique. People still study the battle in detail. They track the various troop movements and the intricate military details. They know the names of all the generals and lower level military people involved. This requires a certain kind of patience, a certain mindset. The word clinical is appropriate here in both its positive and negative connotations. The clinical mindset is one I do not myself possess. I am to clinical as professional wrestler is to brain surgeon. In fact, I suspect that the people who were obsessed with the details of the Battle of Verdun are trying to control something with their supposedly dispassionate attitude to the whole affair. Something about the battle is intolerable to them, to something within them. Some feeling, some root despair or fear is being touched on by the facts of the battle, its reality, its actual happening in the world. To study the battle is to encroach upon that fear and surround it, as it were, with the various analytical tools at one's disposal. Or is there also desire? Is it a mix of fear and desire? The person who studies the Battle of Verdun in a clinical manner has no idea what to do with this potent mix of fear and desire. And therefore, these persons become studiers, even though probably what they really want deep down is to be in the battle, to be in the actual battle and to kill in the battle and to die in the battle, though in some other sense, that's the last thing they want. They want and do not want. They take some pleasure in the distanced ability to study the battle and to participate in it that way. And this distance is also, at the same time, a kind of torture. I don't have the desire to understand and to encroach upon the battle in that way, but I often find myself thinking about the Battle of Verdun. My pulse quickens when the battle comes up in conversation or on the radio or in books. I remember many years ago watching a television documentary about World War I and about the Battle of Verdun in particular. The narrator uttered the following line: "It was one of the most brutal, most sinister battles in military history." As I recall, the narrator spoke with a British accent. He placed special emphasis on the words brutal and sinister. I don't think I'd ever heard a battle referred to as sinister in a documentary before. Brutal, yes, but war is always brutal. So it is surprising when the narrator of this particular documentary does not stop at the word brutal. His voice continues on, rising in pitch and volume. When he utters the word sinister, he is practically spitting. It's not the typical language and diction of a television documentary. Now I'm pausing and we're moving forward to the beginning of the third chapter. Chapter 3, we learn that Franz Marc, the soldier and painter, was also a lover of happy, joyful cows, and that additionally, he was not a pacifist. We learn, in short, that happy cows and war all fit together somehow in the mind of Franz Marc. The Fate of the Animals is an especially striking painting when you note the fact that not 3 years before he painted The Fate of the Animals, Franz Marc painted The Yellow Cow. The Yellow Cow portrays one of the happiest and most carefree cows the world has ever seen. The eponymous yellow cow can only be described as romping, an activity in which it is normally very difficult for a fully grown cow to engage. Nevertheless, Marc's yellow cow does indeed romp. The yellow cow kicks up her back legs and dances through the landscape. There are also a couple of red cows in the background and the painting of the painting, and those cows, while not romping and dancing, do seem to be happily and peacefully grazing on a hillside. Why is Franz Marc's yellow cow so gay? We don't know for sure. The cow does not explain herself. But romping, although unusual when it comes to cows, is not unknown to animals in the field. Any amount of time spent observing animals at their daily business will show that they are sometimes given to sudden acts of romping. Generally, it is true these romping animals tend to be on the youthful side, but not always. Animals of every kind and age, it turns out, engage in sudden expressions of senseless joy. In an earlier age, an age such as the one that Franz Marc was born to, he was born in 1880, it was much more common for people from all walks of life to be familiar with animals, at the very least with the sorts of domesticated animals you can find on a farm. Franz Marc had plenty of experiences where he found himself on foot in the countryside, observing the actions of cows, sheep, goats, deer, and the like. In the period just before 1911, when Marc painted The Yellow Cow, he was spending quite a bit of time in the country, and he was very interested in the behavior of animals. Marc spent the summer of 1905 wandering through the Bavarian Alps. There he began to make sketches of the animals he saw. He was particularly interested at that time in sheep. In 1908, he made a chalk drawing of 2 deer. In 1909, Marc completed an oil painting called Large Landscape 1. The painting depicts a group of horses gathered at the bottom right corner of the canvas. Marc had become especially fascinated by horses. The artistic movement that Marc would become most associated with, Der Blaue Reiter, has as its primary symbol a man on a blue horse. That symbol was created by Wassily Kandinsky for the cover of Der Blaue Reiter almanac published in 1912. But the real painter of blue horses was Marc, not Kandinsky. In fact, many people probably associate Der Blaue Reiter with the image of a blue horse that can be found in Franz Marc's 1911 painting Blue Horse 1, even though this horse has no rider and never appeared on the cover of any Der Blaue Reiter publication. Marc, anyway, was firmly a horse artist by 1910. though he continued to draw and paint other animals up until the time of his death. He painted deer, cows, dogs, and foxes, among others. The fascination with animals had deepened for Mark from the period around 1905 all the way until his death in 1916. You could say that the entirety of Franz Marc's short artistic career, the roughly 10 years from 1905 to 1916, was a matter of painting animals. Mark's was an animal art. One of the things that Mark must have noticed during his observation of animals out in the fields is that the suddenness with which they will begin to romp about. It is almost as if a madness has overtaken them. They turn and jump, or they spin around, or they throw themselves up in the air. You would think something might be wrong, but all it takes is a little more watching, and it becomes clear that nothing is wrong. The animal is happy. More than happy, the animal is feeling a burst of joy for which there isn't perhaps a proper word. Maybe the French word jouissance gets the closest. That word captures the sense of transcending limits and the vaguely sexual, quasi-orgiastic nature of the joy that comes upon animals as they begin to romp. Mark's The Yellow Cow portrays exactly this element of jouissance, if we can call it that, in the leap of the cow as she romps through the countryside. Then just 2 years later, Mark painted The Fate of the Animals. Very soon after that, he was dead, killed with so many others on the battlefield around the French town of Verdun. The obvious interpretation of the development in Mark's art from the painting of animals in their joy and repose to the painting of animals in their terrible fate is that the animals became an allegory for the worsening state of affairs in Europe that finally erupted into World War I. The fate of animals is the fate of Europe, and that fate is very bad. There is some truth to this obvious point, but it can't be the full truth. Mark cannot have been making paintings that all boiled down to the sentiment, war is bad, or even that Europe had fallen into a disaster. That's because Mark didn't feel this way. Or let us say that Mark was unsure of his feelings about war in general, and specifically about the war in which he ultimately lost his life. Mark felt that World War I contained a deeper meaning. Even as early as September 6, 1914, during his first few weeks of experiencing the actual daily life of a soldier engaged in the Great War, Franz Marc was hinting at these deeper meanings. On that day, September 6th, he wrote to Maria about the artillery exchanges he'd been witnessing over the previous week. There is something impressive and mystical about these artillery battles, end quote. We can picture Mark there at the foot of the Vosges Mountains, watching the explosions from the artillery exchanges back and forth across the lines. He was far enough away from the actual danger during those days that he could watch with some dispassion, though for us it is an eerie feeling to read of Mark's fascination with artillery fire, when we know that it is just such a barrage that will strike him down not 2 years later. In the early days of the war, the artillery barrages must have seemed to him like a force of nature. This was grand on a grand scale, like a tremendous thunderstorm unleashing noise and light upon the world. This was a man-made version of the great cosmic show. On September 22, Mark wrote to Maria the following lines. Around noon, I took a delightful ride. The Vosges Mountains have something lovely and peaceful. At times, one can no longer believe in the seriousness of this horrible war until one sees it again with one's own eyes. End quote. Note the exclamation point. Mark calls the war horrible, but he does not use the word horrible in a fully pejorative sense. He uses the word horrible as one who is deeply impressed. The war is horrible, but it is horrible in the way that all serious things are horrible. Mark does not put it this way, but he might as well have used the ancient Greek adjective denos. That which is denos is huge and fearsome and powerful and overwhelming. Mark was drawn to what he found denos about the Great War. He was drawn to it just as he was often repelled by it. But that is the nature of all that is denos. It both attracts and repels. It is grandeur and horror at once. So Mark could never call the war bad. He could never condemn the war as such because he was, in a sense, grateful for the war. And then we're jumping forward one last little section, which is in chapter 11. Everything that Franz Marc ever did with painting, everything that he ever wrote, both before the Great War and then as a soldier in the Great War, was an attempt to affirm that there is a vast and mighty difference between the things that are essential and the things that are non-essential. I cannot overcome, Mark wrote to Maria on December 2, 1915. the insufficiencies and imperfections of life, except by transposing the meaning of my life into the spiritual world, the world that is independent of the mortal body. That is, I must salvage it through abstraction. It is not really future life that I understand by the word spiritual. In that respect, you misunderstand me. But by spiritual life, I mean to separate essential from non-essential things. What it means to become spiritual, to become geistig, Franz Marc is trying to say, trying to tell his wife Maria, trying to tell us. What it means to enter existence on the plane of what is geistig is to live essentially in the here and now, not to look toward another realm, to look toward heaven or to the afterlife. Mark is thinking, among other things, no doubt, of those passages in the gospel stories where Jesus says to people that the kingdom of heaven is not a place off somewhere in the distance, but that the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, is actually right here. Here it is. It is there, directly, within you. What does it take to recognize the kingdom of heaven that is inside you? It takes, if nothing else, the willingness to purge what is non-essential, the willingness to let much that is non-essential drop away, to let it be burned away. Every day, Mark tells his wife Maria, later in that very same letter of December 2, 1915, I throw more on the pile of the non-essential. The beautiful thing, Mark continues, in doing this is that the essential does not get smaller or narrower, but on the contrary, more powerful and grand. This is why Mark can feel grateful for the Great War, even in all its horrors. The Great War is a kind of terrible vehicle for purification, for abstracting away all that is non-essential, for burning away all that is not geistig in its most essential sense. The impossible situation, Franz Marc writes to Maria, meaning the very difficulty and the incredible tension and the extreme situations that the war had placed Mark under, into which the war has, quote, into which the war has pushed my personality, has greatly clarified my being, end quote. And we'll stop there. It goes on and on like that.
Thanks, Morgan. You certainly could read more if you want, but I'll take this as our opportunity to maybe chat about the book a bit. So this morning when I was typing the social media blurb to invite people to join us tonight, I found myself typing, take a break from election fatigue by attending an event discussing art, war, and apocalypse. And I realized maybe that was a funny thing to do inadvertently. You started this book, wrote this book, and completed this book before the war in Ukraine, but it's hard not to hear some of these passages in relation to what essentially has become a kind of artillery war that we were enduring day to day. So I think one of the larger questions to ask is, this is over 100 years ago. So is what you're writing about still our world? We're different. We must be different to some extent, but presumably there is some substantial overlap of existential, philosophical, cultural dimensions of modernity unveiled in World War I. So I'm just curious as to how you hope the book might resonate in relationship to, how people are interpreting the world around them now.
Yeah. One thing I do like to read old things that I'm not sure always are relevant, or I'm not quite sure what the relevance would be. Maybe I find out later, maybe I don't know maybe I never know. So I don't know if I worry about relevance. Sometimes maybe I feel relevance either will take care of itself or won't. But another thing that Franz Marc and other people end up talking about, D.H. Lawrence, Nietzsche always seems to pop up for me. over and over again. They're constantly talking about the problems of modernity or the modern world, or variations on that. I don't, I lived in, Shifi and I lived in New York City for many years, and I love to watch that kind of classic era of 30s and 40s American films that somehow have just a special aura to them, or something's magical there. But one of the things we always comment to each other, and I always notice it, is like, oh, New York's just the same then. Like the things you're seeing, the things people are talking about, the way that they're talking about themselves as suddenly modern. It's like we've been talking about ourselves as suddenly modern, and the problem of the modernity. It's like the oldest thing in the world, and yet we constantly redo it all over and over again. And that is a huge thing driving Mark, for sure, and all the other people I end up talking about, and also in the same, I think often in the same sort of double thing of, oh my God, this is a disaster, and yet it's so amazing and an opportunity, and one couldn't go back yet either, and yet what a hell, a most extraordinary beloved hell that we butt up against again and again. Something like that maybe makes art like Franz Marc's seem very present, very contemporary, as do so many things. Yeah, that's the best I can do with that one.
No, I certainly don't think you feel any stress to be relevant. I guess, it's a question of precisely, is this the same world that we live in? What you say about observing violence and deploring it, but also being attracted to it, it's very reminiscent to me of Walker Percy's, the way he talks about how we respond to emergencies, to plane crashes, to hurricanes. We both say it's horrible, and then if the plane crashes a mile from us, we jump in our car and we speed to the scene of the hideous, the horror. And I think one of the things you stressed about the war in general was the strange nature of a kind of the death wish dimension to it, and that we sort of, Mark wants to see the war as a kind of purification and cleansing, and so there's a kind of embrace. I mean, that's a normal human ambiguity, but at the same time, it seems wrong, almost like a sin to do that. And yet maybe there's a kind of honesty to it. Can you play with that for a minute, or?
Yeah, I think you just played with it probably plenty good, but yeah, someone please destroy this world now. No, wait, don't, please don't do it. Wait, maybe destroy it a little. Wait, don't. Yes, I don't know, maybe that's always a factor in all civilization, in the history of civilization. You certainly see, I remember hearing Debbie Blue once give like a talk, or I guess it was kind of a sermon. For people who don't know Debbie Blue, she's sort of a punk rock pastor or something like that. I don't know how would you describe her? But she said, she's talking about the passages in Genesis, and then God is like, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. Oh my God, I hate it. Let's destroy it. So if God can play around with that notion, I guess it must be pretty baked in to the nature of it all. That's my excuse. Flippancy aside, there's something deeply disturbing about Franz Marx. I mean, he's in the war too. He's witnessing it. He's there day to day. And the letters are incredible because he's fully able to express the horror and the wrongness of the war. And on the other hand, still feel that like in some ways he deserves it. Everyone deserves it. It's deserved. It's necessary. Maybe it would be better if some other way of waking up could have happened, but this still amounts to a kind of waking up for him that is terrible and fearsome and traumatic, but somehow satisfying to him. And I mean, I can't reconcile all those things in Mark, but that's what makes the letters and the arts so deep, because it's not just simple or easy, and the edges are sharp as hell.
We've got a bunch of questions already in. I think the first two are closely related. So let me step aside and let our audience do some of the asking here. The first one says, please explain more about the word concept geistig. And then the second question says, this distinction between the essential and the non-essential is splendid, but I wonder exactly what do you mean? What are some of the things Mark or you have found to be non-essential?
I'm going to actually have to do some work here. Damn it. Okay, geistig. Geistig is a German word, Geistig. If you the Hochdeutsch is get that hard, geistig. Geistig, you could say. It comes from Geist, which is a German word that you could say means mind, spirit. A little hard to translate precisely. Geist is something maybe personal, but maybe something beyond personal, like the Geist of a time or a period you can talk about, or the Geist of people, or even, or the Geist, so it's a big word, and also a somewhat hard to precisely define word. So something that's geistig, the adjective of it, is something that's you could say spiritual, though that could potentially seem to woo-woo or something. To maybe the geistig is a little, it's German, so it's yeah. So I go on a fairly long, typical for me, kind of rant, I guess, on the word geistig and why it's important, and why Mark is sort of obsessed with or interested in this word and some of its resonances. So in the section I read, I kind of just jumped into it a little bit, but there is a buildup to it. The point being that art is not just about, for Mark, is not just about showing you something having a visual experience. It's not about being presented with amazing craft, or someone who has great skills or something. It has to be something that reveals. I mean, that's where we get into the apocalypse revelation stuff, which is in the subtitle, but kind of comes out later as you get further into the book. Something is revealed, and when art is pushing beyond what's immediately apparent, that would be then getting maybe into the essential, non-essential. Then it's maybe showing us things we always knew or always suspected, maybe what's hidden in plain sight. I don't think the non-essential and non-essential is a simple thing of like making categories. This stuff, yogurt is non-essential. No, yogurt would be essential. Cottage cheese is non-essential. While that might be a fairly good ordering of things, it's not the essential and non-essential that that Franz Marc is talking about. It's not even so much that you would categorize things as you would see that there's a essential way of having a relationship with anything, mundane things. It's not. So he's trying to look just at the world around him. He's trying to see a fox in the wood. The fox in the wood is just a thing of life, a created thing, a creature. And there's a way to see that non-essentially, to just, that's a passing experience in one's life. And there's another moment to really see it, to really experience that this fox is not just a creature. It is all creatures. It is everything. It is the possibility of there being life at all. Now we start to pass into the apophatic, we pass into things which maybe can't exactly be clearly said. They go beyond discursive reason. They get us into the realm of something that you just, some geistig faculty starts to apprehend at that point, starts to see the power and the tragedy and the wonder of just that one little fox existing in that forest. But it's somehow a story bigger than you could even. Am I making any sense at all? That's the problem when you get into something like that. It's that territory where words even fall apart for us, is where you're moving from the non-essential to the essential for Marc. And it's not about that everything is inherently non-essential in one sense, and that we cannot really see it. And everything is fundamentally essential if we are in a proper comportment toward it. That's the best I can. That's all I got.
Oh, that's great, Morgan. It's definitely territory for the mystics and the apophatic theologians to help us navigate. But I think it's intriguing, and it certainly intuitively strikes home. I think all of us recognize this, even if we struggle to put it into words. We do have some more questions. Here's one. You seem to dive rather deeply into Marc's psyche in various chapters. Which reference points, pieces of literature, if any, gave you the most insight into his thinking?
Yeah. It's just the letters themselves. You have to read the letters. They really are. I mean, I forget the exact quote that I put in there which is in the preface to this edition of these letters, calling them one of the great treasures of German literature or something like that. I don't know. According to Marc himself, he wasn't a particularly good writer, and really saw himself as having a visual mind, being a painter, like deeply just being a painter. And always felt that his ability to put any of these things into words was inadequate at best. But somehow, maybe it was the experience of actually being a soldier in this terrifying war. Maybe it was being out of his normal circle of life, friends and circle of life. And something happened that he managed to write these just deeply honest, soul-searching, very moving, sometimes beautifully described also just very warm and tender to the love of his life. And then he'll flip into these incredibly thoughtful analysis of what painting is and what he's trying to do when he's painting, what it means to try to paint in a way that no one's figured out yet, the possibilities for paint. He becomes very excited about what's just on the horizon. And it feels so real. He's so crystal clear in those letters. I think I mentioned this sort of in the book, not really, I guess, that I was never a huge fan of his art, actually, until I read the letters. And then I read the letters and I realized I wasn't seeing the art right. I wasn't really seeing I wasn't seeing. I was blind. And when I went back to the paintings after reading these incredible passages in these letters, all of a sudden they were just like, I mean, they were overwhelming to me sometimes, these paintings. So much happening in them. And yet they're so simple too. They're very, structurally simple, actually, as color and shape on a canvas. So yeah, that's it.
Here's another question. I love your description of romping. I once saw a YouTube clip of cows released from the barn in early spring. It was astounding to see them romp, leaping as if they could go over the moon. And then the follow-up is, tell us more about your voice of Franz Marc. I'm not entirely sure what that means, but that's literally what the question says. Tell us more about your voice of Franz Marc.
Well, first on romping. Yes, romping is good. I'm a city boy. So I grew up in LA and then lived in New York City for 20 years and now live in Detroit. Maybe that was one of the reasons I was blind to Marc's art too. I didn't get the romping. I didn't really know that animals romp, I think, is the thing here. And it turns out that is not an unimportant fact about the world. I did have some time away from New York City in a period of living a few other places, including in the country in upstate New York, and then in Sri Lanka for a year, where I had some seriously kick-ass experiences with water buffalo, and got to be friends with some water buffalo. And I would say that my sense of animal life was changed and transformed by that, which also helped me then to see what Marc was showing us in these paintings. And one of my transformations maybe was seeing that I am not separate from these creatures in any of the ways that I maybe thought and pretended and projected myself into being separate from, or having like a fundamentally different form of experience. Of course, the world is filled with difference operates, and oneness operates, and the relationship between those two things is one of the great metaphysical mysteries that all philosophies and religions have dealt with, the one and the many. I mean, these are just root conundrums. But I guess I hadn't, to the degree to which I started to, let's say in the last 10 years of my life, like really confront the being cow of me, or the whatever. And that's something I think Franz Marc is showing us in these paintings very powerfully. If you give them the time, you give the canvases the time and space to do that. And the romping helps, because the romping, I don't know, it's you can immediately relate to the to the romping, and then maybe some of the things that are harder come too. What was the other thing? I think there was something else.
Oh, it was just tell us more about your voice of Franz Marc. And I'm not sure I understand the question.
Sure. Maybe whoever asked that can clarify that more. Yeah, voice.
Jump to the next one.
I mean, I do feel like I kind of took on to some degree Marc's voice a little bit from the letters, and then I felt like I started to get the flow of his prose and could speak for him, I guess. Maybe that's the question. Could I speak for? Yes, I can speak for Franz Marc authoritatively, I do believe. The answer is yes. I am him, he is me. No, I can't. And I force him to say things he probably wouldn't. But that's I get to do that because I made an art. He made an art, and then I made an art, and I did feel like somehow that it was okay to kind of extend myself into Franz Marc a little in doing that, if that was what the voice thing was about.
Sure. Here's a question maybe going in the opposite direction. If you could ask Marc anything, what would you ask?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in a way, it's he's one of the few people I almost feel like I don't have anything to ask him. Like, it's all there. So there isn't anything that comes up. It's more than asking him something. I do feel, I think I even say this in my little preface, that I dedicate the book to my good friend, Abbas Raza, who took me to Basel in Switzerland to see The Fate of the Animals, that it hangs at the art museum in Basel. But I also dedicate it to Franz Marc. I think I say something corny as like the friend I never actually met or something ridiculous like that. But I did kind of feel that way, that yeah, maybe that's why I also felt a little like I could take on his voice to some degree and extend it and continue it. So more than ask him something, I think I'd just like to spend a day in the woods with him, looking at animals, being with animals. And I don't think we'd need to talk much, actually. Maybe some very pregnant glances we would exchange.
The questioner says, I meant choice, but voice offers an interesting conundrum. Thank you for your answer. And so I'll move on to the next one, which is, what kind of influence did Franz Marc's letters have after they were published? Did they affect later artists and thinkers' views of war?
This question is maybe above my scholarly pay grade, in that I'm not a scholar of Franz Marc, and I'm coming at this as raw material for writing something of my own, but not as an attempt to write a definitive biography of Franz Marc or anything even vaguely like that. Thus, I can dedicate many pages to the romping of cows and whatnot. So yeah, I don't think they had too much influence. I think they are deeply non-influential letters, and maybe that's just about right. I do think those who've read them and they may be more read in German, uh, you know, artsy circles, but I've never heard, I didn't know they existed. I've never really heard them referenced to. Um, I'm not aware of them having much of an, yeah, I can't think of any direct influence. And in terms of the attitude towards war, I mean, the attitude towards war in those letters, as I'm kind of trying to relate, is so weird and ambivalent and ambiguous and hard to really get. I mean, in a way, I take this whole book to try to figure out, to kind of figure that out. And in the end, there's no definitive answer to it, but it does get us into all these other questions: what art really is, what is living a authentic life, you know, all this other stuff sort of spills out of it as soon as you try to figure these questions out. Like what is he really saying about this war? Why is he making these statements that do not seem obvious to me, and I'm not sure what he's getting at. And that's how I use them in the book, to try to open up into these other questions. And in the end, I kind of leave the war behind, except that it, returns at the very end because of this series of drawings that he made in his sketch, just black and white pencil drawings he made, which are the last works of Franz Marc that he made in the field in his last days on Earth. Before this and during this extended battle. And those drawings are freaking amazing. And an incredible thing that someone engaged in one of the most fearsome battles that's ever been fought on this planet. And he's making these incredibly subtle and beautiful and vibrant and exuberant paintings, again, of animals in these various states of abstraction in the natural world. That's what he's sitting during this war doing. It's really pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, with all the romping and the exuberance in some ways of these paintings, it does seem to be a kind of response to an answer that he gives to some extent, in the face of destruction and self-destruction and the senselessness of war. I mean, you talk about Nietzsche, you talk about, you know, the difficulty, modern despair, or maybe perennial despair. Let's dispense with modern then. It does seem to be like a vote in favor of being over non-being. I mean, do you see that in the larger scope of his vision?
Absolutely. Which is why this, I think this book ends, and I think he ended on a very moving affirmation, a yes somehow to it all, for sure. With the recognition that destruction is wrapped up in creation, that destruction is a kind of creation and creation is a kind of destruction. I think he was seeing that in a deep way. But the whole cosmic show dance, the fact that creation must be es muss sein, that suffering, that all being is flaming suffering, and yet in the end we affirm that, is absolutely, in my sense of his art and also in those letters, I think it's undeniable, unmistakable. That's there through to the very end, to the very last sketch he makes days before his death.
Let me finish with a question. I realize why you might be hesitant to be pigeonholed or categorized. I mean, one of the things I admire about the series of 2 books that you've now published in what you call the 3 paintings trilogy is precisely that you're not setting up some kind of schematic, some kind of clear progression, but you have envisioned a 3rd book, and that's going to be, I was going to say, about Joni Mitchell, but my brain always does that. I apologize. About a patron named Joan Mitchell. Are you willing to say anything without being pigeonholed or schematized about either what to expect with the third book or what you feel some of the arc of the trilogy is, or maybe they're just similar beats that essentially are taking three works and kind of doing similar things to those three works? Help me out here with some response.
There will be more romping. Yeah, there is a third book. There's a Three Pangs trilogy after all. I owe you all that, at least. Yeah, and not just envisioned. I am well into it. I'm well into the weeds on Joan Mitchell. It focuses around a painting called the Girolata Triptych. Maybe one thing is this underlying underlying maybe the Drunken Silenus, which is the first one, and this and the Fate of the Animals, and then the Girolata Triptych. Okay, I'll reveal this here now tonight. Amazingly, I will reveal this hitherto unknown tidbit. I guess maybe it is kind of my defense of a version of romanticism that I think is valid, alive, vibrant, sustaining. It makes us not have to destroy this world, but in fact, actually love it, even though it might not deserve it much of the time. That romanticism is still here and continues to live. It lives, and isn't always what you think it is either. So that's one little, but don't tell anyone else that's secret.
Well, I hope at some point you expand upon that. I guess what you're saying is that the trilogy essentially is elucidating that or elaborating that, although the individual artists wouldn't necessarily be artists that you would jump out and say, that's a romantic artist.
No, the opposite, which is why I like it. And that's why you are all privy to my secret schemes, that romanticism is more powerful when it sneaks up on you.
Well, that is something absolutely I look forward to on many different levels. Was there anything else that you would like to say about the book or share that you didn't get a chance to? I certainly feel privileged to be let in on that big secret.
No, I feel satisfied. I feel very satisfied here and worn out. So thank you. Thank you, Greg. And thank you everyone for coming.
Oh, you're absolutely most welcome. Art for modeling what I think criticism can and should be and isn't as often as it should be, and that is philosophically and historically grounded, but at the same time accessible and even fun. It has been an honor to be with you tonight. The Fate of the Animals is available for purchase in cloth-bound, paperback, and ebook editions through all the major online retailers. If you go to the book's webpage at slantbooks.org, which I've placed in the chat, you can find links to several of those outlets, including IndieBound and bookshop.org, two of the retail outlets that we favor for being not the big guys. Our next online book launch will be roughly a month from now on December 14th, when we will feature the fourth and final volume in the John Motes mystery series by Daniel Taylor, a novel called The Mystery of Iniquity. In this fourth and final entry in the John Motes mysteries, our accidental sleuth and his sister Judy find themselves entangled in an international web of evil done and evil revenged. The often confused but always curious John finds himself the father of triplets, and for reasons not always clear even to himself, back in church. Judy, a woman with mental challenges but a heart as wide as the horizon, is now living with John and his wife Zilla, helping them to raise, quote, our children. New to church, but somehow appointed to the missions committee, soon renamed the Care and Compassion Committee, John is asked to be the liaison with an immigrant family from Iraq the church wishes to aid. No one realizes that offering such help puts everyone in jeopardy, as evil done afar comes near to roost. The cast of characters from past novels in the series reappears, including the band of residents from Judy's group home and the iron-willed theologian Sister Bridget. All are involved in this dramatic investigation into the nature of evil in the human experience, and all contribute to John's stumbling but dogged pilgrimage toward greater wholeness. The Mystery of Iniquity is available for pre-order now, and while you're at it, order whichever of the first 3 books in the series you don't yet have. Tonight's event has been recorded and will soon be available on the Slant book page, our YouTube channel, and of course through our podcast, Slantcast. You can now subscribe to Slantcast through all the major outlets, including Spotify, Apple, Audible, SoundCloud, and many others. And as we've just marked the first anniversary of Slant's transition from being a literary imprint to a fully independent, not-for-profit press, we'd like to remind you that your tax-deductible donations make possible bold and innovative, yes, and even challenging books like The Fate of the Animals. To support our work, just go to slantbooks.org and click on Donate. Finally, remember to tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Thanks again, and see you next time.